Hi, folks. We'll just wait a minute or two for people to join the webinar before we get started. I'm not sure if it's better to see the 300 people who have registered or to not see them at all. But yeah, we only have an hour tonight, and so I think I'm going to get us underway. So my name is Seb. I am a board member with Peace Brigades International Canada, and it's my real pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar on Gitxsan and Gitanyow resistance to colonial megaprojects. I'm going to be moderating and speaking to you from the Kwanghan and Kwasinich territories, colonially known as Victoria, itself a colonial megaproject and the seat of provincial authority. In thinking locally about struggles here, I just wanted to give a shout out to Carl Olson, who is Kwasinich and has been out at Goldstream for over a year, every Tuesday morning from 10 until 12, raising awareness about the Ministry of Transportation's plans to widen the Malahat, which would entail putting pilings into Goldstream, cutting down 700 trees, and this project is deeply unwanted by the Kwasinich, and I know Carl is asking for support there, so people can, who are from around here, can join. That would be great. Yeah, and in thinking internationally, to borrow George Manuel's phrase of the indigenous fourth world, I'm thinking, of course, about Palestine, the ongoing genocide there, and the efforts by Palestinians and so many others to get an immediate ceasefire to stop the arms trade. And so those things are on my mind. But yeah, and segging to our topic tonight and thinking about settler colonialism here on Turtle Island, I think it's safe to say that whatever the reconciliation moment, the TRC moment was, it is over. I'm thinking about the Yellowhead Institute and Eva Jewell's work tracking the 94 calls to action and how exactly 0 of them were accomplished last year. And yeah, in the heels of that, of course, we're seeing new colonial resource extraction and transport projects being proposed all over the place. And tonight we're focusing on those that are going to impact Gitanyow and Gitxsan territories. And yeah, and so I just want to thank our panelists tonight, Tara Marsden and Colin Sutherland-Wilson, Miriam Adrangi and Kai Nagata. I really, really appreciate you finding the time to share what you know with us. And yeah, I just want to get started. We're going to start with Kai. And let's just start with the facts. Can you tell us something about these colonial mega projects and introduce yourself and any affiliations you want to? Thanks, Kai.
Sure, Seb. Thanks a lot. So my name's Kai Nagata. My family's actually from Carl Olson's territory on Skibak, on Main Island. I live now on Delgamuchlakiep up here in the Gitxsan homelands in the Kispiox Valley. And I work at Dogwood, which is a partner in the Abolish Kurg campaign, and has been trying to do some work to raise awareness, especially down south in the big population centers around some of the egregious shit that's going on up here around Highway 16, the northern half of the province. So let me just share my screen and I'll walk you through just some of the stuff that people are facing up here in this part of the world. So this is not on Gitxsan or Gitanyow territory, but I think we're all familiar at this point with the Coastal GasLink pipeline project. There you can see top right some of the Dinizé, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who have been steadfast in opposing this pipeline route and offered an alternate route, but were ignored and have had their territories and rights trampled at gunpoint. Bottom right, you can see the members of the Kurg unit in their regalia showing up at the on Gitamden territory there in order to conduct arrests during one of their raids. On the left, you can see the pipeline itself just absolutely trashing a wonderful salmon nursery. It's a wetland on Unistoten territory that their engineers managed to screw up possibly permanently. And bottom left is General David Petraeus, who is the four-star American general who wrote the field manual on counterinsurgencies and now works in the private sector for KKR, which is the company that owns Coastal GasLink, advising them and directing their corporate counterinsurgency tactics against local people standing up for water and land. So what if I told you that the same company has a whole other pipeline already permitted north of Highway 16? This is the Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Project, and it's a pipeline that is the same diameter, the same size as Coastal GasLink, and TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, is the company responsible. So what we're talking about is another fracked gas or methane gas pipeline from the desiccated, smoldering Peace Country of Northeast BC, where the fracking happens, all the way past a bunch of compressor stations. These are basically 60 to 90 megawatt gas-fired power stations running 24/7, belching out emissions, going under some of the last remaining productive salmon rivers in the world. You can see that tunnel for the drill portal that was from Coastal GasLink. They'd be using similar technology to get under the Skeena, the Nass, the Kispiox rivers. And then on the west coast, it would be, of course, linking up with an export terminal to export LNG. So this route, which would go through, as I mentioned, the Babine, which is right in the middle of your screen there, the Skeena, the Kispiox, that would take it right through unceded Gitxsan Lachiep, which would impact 12 different house territories, and then directly to the west and the next valley over through Gitanyow territory as well. And from there, the project would go westward down the Nass Valley, following the river through Nisga'a Treaty lands and out to the coast. And the idea with PRGT is to link up with this new proposed terminal called Slissoms on the coast. This is an artist's rendering that's designed to make it look as benign as possible. But the terminals there, you can see the floating liquefaction terminals would consume power equivalent to the entire output of the Site C dam. This is an absolutely enormous mega project with impacts, obviously, in the Nass River estuary and all of the upriver communities. And Slissoms, it looks like a indigenous-inspired design, maybe a whale's tail, lots of nice colors. It looks like a real friendly project. Who is behind this LNG mega project? It is the Nisga'a Lissoms government, but partnered with the Nisga'a are Western LNG out of Houston, Texas, and a consortium of fracking companies in Alberta that calls themselves Rockies LNG Partners, which is led by Tourmaline Oil Corp, and that is the biggest fracking company in Canada. And they have a large complement of lobbyists, mostly ex-NDP politicians and staffers who've been prowling the halls in Victoria to try and ensure a smooth ride for the Slissoms terminal through the environmental assessment process, which is happening right now, and I'm sure Tara will tell us more about. I'll mention there's also a whole other competing pipeline. This is the Enbridge West Coast Connector gas transmission line, which would follow a different route through Gitxsan territory, but a similar route through Gitnyow and down again into the Nass watershed. This project is currently on hold, thanks to some organizing work by, well, some people on this call and maybe a horde of zombies that took over the environment minister's office. So that's good news. And now these two projects both have certificates that will expire in November if we can find ways to run out the clock. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure. And I just wanted to mention a couple of other projects that are also looming in the region at the same time as these pipelines and LNG export terminals. One of them is the Vopak bulk liquid fuels terminal in Prince Rupert, or Ridley Island next to Prince Rupert. This would be, we're talking about methanol, diesel, gasoline, and propane that would be loaded onto 150 tankers a year. That's my rough sketch of the project footprint there next to the coal transshipment terminal. And this would require 240 train cars a day on top of existing traffic down the Skeena River. It's a single rail line, and the engineers who drive these trains call them bomb trains for a reason. So this is another project which, of course, carries large risks for ecosystems and also just human safety. This would go through a number of Gitxsan reserve communities on the Skeena, as well as the city of Terrace. However, Vopak has yet to make a final investment decision, so that's just approved. Of course, the BC government thinks it's a great idea, but it's just looming over us at the moment. We just found out about this terminal last week. This is a rather bonkers LNG by rail proposal in Prince George. So the company's called JX LNG. They have fracking holdings in Alberta, and the idea is to pipeline that to Prince George and then build a terminal that would be, again, powered by the Site C dam in order to compress that gas and put it onto rail cars. You can see those bottom left. And again, that would add onto the existing bomb train traffic from Prince George all the way to Prince Rupert and then onto ships from there. It's totally bonkers. We're not going to let this happen, obviously, but it just illustrates sort of the audacity and maybe desperation of some of these companies as we reach the end of the fossil fuel era. And I'll mention one more mega project, which is the KSM mine. This is the part of the site that you can see in a photo by Garth Lenz for the Narwhal. What to say about KSM? This is a project which they have made an application to the BC government for a substantial start determination. And what that means is the owners are trying to extend the project certificate indefinitely in order to find investors that are willing to pony up billions and billions of dollars to build an open pit copper and gold mine in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. This would require a tailings dam that is one of the tallest in the world, much taller than Red Chris, which you can see top left, which is already a behemoth, taller than the Shangri-La, which is the tallest building in Vancouver, and of course would perch indefinitely, forever, above the Nass watershed, which is the backbone of Gitanyow culture and food security, and would just exist above the river forever if the plan were to go ahead. So that's another threat that I think is worth mentioning. Seb framed this as talking about colonial mega projects, and I was asking myself, well, what makes a mega project a colonial mega project? And I have a few thoughts to offer on that before I wrap up, which I'm sure Tara and Colin will add to. But from my perspective as a British Columbian, I would say it's all about how the province operates to deny and suppress Indigenous rights and title and decision-making authority over their lands. And so the Crown, from the get-go, claims 95% of the land in BC, and it issues very powerful rights to that land to private corporations through a complex system of leases and permits, through processes which I would argue are rigged and limited in order to deliver almost always a yes outcome for these applications. Those corporations are also subsidized with public money in various different forms. A new tax break was unveiled in the BC budget this month for oil and gas companies. And where the government claims this authority over the land and claims jurisdiction over the environment, they have wide discretion over whether and how they enforce their own laws. And so we've seen over and over that the bigger the company, the more reluctant the Crown is to actually enforce the laws or enforce any kind of accountability. And we saw that with the Mount Poly disaster. The Crown also issues court injunctions to corporations when local people say, hang on, that wasn't your decision to make, or this use of the land is not compatible with our laws on how to take care of the land. The Crown issues the injunctions, and then the Crown pays for the police and the prosecutors and the jails, as we've seen on Wet'suwet'en territory. And finally, we've seen this for over 100 years, but basically the Crown spends a lot of our money fighting Indigenous nations in court to deny their title and rights right to the bitter end. They often lose, but they still, as a matter of principle, always oppose claims of Indigenous title and criminalize Indigenous people exercising their rights. So I would say in combination, all of those factors make these projects colonial mega projects. And of course, when we're talking about the Crown in BC, we're really talking about the authority delegated to the Premier, the Honorable David Eby, King's Counsel, who is in charge of ultimately these policies. I'll just close by hopefully mentioning some things that are not a bummer. This is the Skeena River. This is the lifeblood of a watershed that's bigger than half the countries in Europe. This is just a short walk from where I'm speaking to you from today. On both sides of the river there, you can see old growth, cedar and hemlock, and ancient trails and cache pits and fishing sites all the way down both sides of the river. It's an incredible place. This is where PRGT Pipelines wants to put their gas pipeline through, but that's not going to happen for reasons we're going to explore on this webinar. And I just wanted to shout out also Wilpes Wielitz. This is a member of that house group in Gitanyow territory, harvesting some of the incredible abundance on the Mesiaden River, which is a tributary of the Nass. And I'll just close by saying there's just incredible abundance and wealth in this part of the world. It's really mind-blowing as somebody who grew up down south. And this is what's at stake. So I'll pass it over to Tara and Colin to talk about what they and their families and governments are doing in order to pass that wealth on to the next generation.
Thank you so much, Kai. Yeah, it honestly just turns my stomach to see those projects. And imagining people like Pierre Poilievre calling that economic reconciliation. Yeah, and the contrast between the beauty of the land and the people who've always lived there. Yeah, so we're on to Tara, and before we dive into the details of the projects that Kai named, Tara, I just wondered if you might want to say something about things that you and Gitanyow have learned from Wet'suwet'en resistance to CGL, and if you want to introduce yourself. Thanks.
Doik Sitnin Seb, Doik Sitnism, Simgigat, Sigadam Hanak, Gantklupuiltsuk, Dinaze, Sakuze, Skyze. I've looked at the participant list. I'm so honored. So many Gitxsan people are on our viewing participants, as well as some Wet'suwet'en friendly names. So thank you for joining Doik Sitnism, and good evening, everybody. Thank you, Kai, for that great overview of some of the major projects that we're facing. And yeah, absolutely, Seb, what we've learned from the Wet'suwet'en, and you know, the Gitanyow Chiefs stood in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en all through, I think it was 2019 through to 2021, where we had multiple events. We had demonstrations and rallies. And, you know, our chiefs came out in their blankets with their drums and walked the streets of Smithers with the crowds, and really showed that they weren't alone, and that we understood at that point that what these projects were about were not about economic reconciliation. They're actually about domination over our people and our lands. And our learning is that, you know, consent only works when we say yes. If we say no, and if we say no even with science behind us and our knowledge and our laws behind us, then we will be met with force. We will be met with force from the SERG, from militarized invasion and occupation, intimidation, harassment, and that all of the promises that we've seen be made through the environmental assessment process for the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So the promises of we won't affect salmon habitat. We've seen that that's not true. They have drilled under all of their salmon-bearing creeks and rivers during spawning season and migration season. They have released sediment, they have released toxins and pollution into those same waterways. And so for us, it's been such a learning experience in the last 10 years since those projects were approved, the PRGT especially. We've learned a lot, and that's what informed consent is about, is you adapt and you learn, and you make your decisions based on the information that's available. And so just continued support for the Wet'suwet'en and continued observation and monitoring of what's actually happening, what actually could happen in our territory and the Gitxsan territory if these projects go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, and speaking of like, and thinking about the projects that Kai named, do you want to say something about how Gitanyow are relating to them?
Yes, absolutely. So first, I just really wanted to name what is the baseline, the new baseline in Gitxsan and Gitanyow territories, and that's climate changed. It's climate changed with a D. It's past tense. It has happened just in my lifetime. And my daughter thinks that I'm old, but I'm not that old. But the things have changed. And so I grew up on the Kitwanka Cedarville back road, and our snowpack used to be over my head as a young girl. And that was low elevation areas. There'd be even more snowpack in the higher elevation mountains. And just in the past, few decades, our snowpack this year for 2024 is estimated to be 40% below average. So what that means is that if we have another hot, dry summer like we did last year, we're going to see more of wildfires, more droughts, and we're going to see lower water levels in our lakes and water available for not only for our own community use, but affecting salmon especially and other species in the salmon ecosystems. So we've also recently Gitxsan completed a glacier inventory and found that the majority of glaciers that are currently cooling the downstream salmon habitat in Mesiaden, the photo that Kai showed there, those are going to be significantly reduced or melted by the end of this century. And glaciers are really that plan B for salmon. So where we had snowpack in historic times supporting salmon habitat, glaciers are now that backstop, and they will be gone by the end of this century. In 2018 and last year in our larger Gitxsan area, we saw wildfires, severe wildfires for the first time in many of our lives. The one near Gitanyow we had in 2018, we went out and visited last summer to see if life had returned. And life sadly had not returned. So, normally with cultural burns and lower severity fires, we see mushrooms and berries and all these plants coming back after a fire. But these intense fires, the life takes a lot longer to return. And so the trees that are left standing too are actually not alive. They're not living anymore. And so this is, our baseline. This is the new Gitxsan baseline. This is what projects need to look at when they're proposing things, is this is sort of the cumulative effect. And a lot of people think, well, climate change is global. What can I do? It's, decisions are being made elsewhere about climate change, but these examples of these fossil fuel projects, we have to just move away from fossil fuel projects. And LNG, even though there's claims that it's going to be a green energy project, it's still a fossil fuel. It still has major greenhouse gas emissions, which will contribute further to climate change. So there's some messaging around, that by displacing coal use in Asia, that LNG is going to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so we've explored that because that would be a good thing if we could actually prove that. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And there's a lot of advertising that's happening around that. And so we've done a thorough analysis of the net zero claims of Xilisms, which does include also PRGT pipeline. And it's simply the evidence is just not there. So they haven't scoped in major things like the shipping, the international shipping, the gas extraction in Treaty 8 territory, the construction of the pipeline, the clearing of the pipeline right of way. All of that has greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. And also there's the need for electricity. And so with LNG, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount, they have to have electricity. And that helps cool the gas to make it liquefied. And in order to do that, what we've found is that they would need 1 or 2 Site C dams worth of power just for the Xilism's LNG. So we all have high BC Hydro bills. We all know the cost of living is skyrocketing. And this demand for electricity could divert and take away from our communities or could drive our prices up even higher. So it's really subsidizing a fossil fuel project, which is what allows them to even say that they can reduce some of the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's an underestimation of overall greenhouse gas emissions for Xilisms and the construction of a possible new BC Hydro line between Prince George and Terrace and then north to Xilisms. And through recent Freedom of Information requests by a Narwhal reporter, we found that there are a small number of First Nations and BC Hydro who might try and exempt this new power line from environmental assessment. And so having some type of behind closed doors process to get power to support LNG. And the other thing I wanted to mention about just the notions of Indigenous support behind some of these. And absolutely, we will not all agree. There are some of our neighbors, some of our friends and relatives who are supporting these projects, and that's their right. But really, it's a mischaracterization to say that what we're seeing in a lot of advertising recently is that BC LNG is Indigenous LNG. And so there are many different nations who have different positions. And there are many people within those nations who may not have been consulted by their leadership. And so it's very misleading, and we don't want to have that sort of representation out in the world. And then I do also want to mention around the social impacts. I mentioned, the cost of living as one. But there are other impacts to our region from these major projects that we've seen again with evidence, and it's not just sort of speculation, it's evidence. So one that really stood out to us was the mayor of Terrace. And so everyone is familiar with the community of Terrace. And so the mayor of Terrace has even come out saying that LNG is not all it's cut out to be in terms of benefits. And there's significant impacts in their community to housing especially, so impacts to increase the cost of housing, and that the average person can simply not afford to have to own a home in Terrace, and 1 out of every 8 people in Terrace is now homeless. And so this is what he's attributing directly to the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the terminal in Kitimat. Similarly, with the access to healthcare in Terrace, that if you go into Terrace, you know that the hospital is usually overrun. We have diversions in Hazelton. Our emergency room is often closed. And so just think of all of these new foreign workers that will be coming into our area and putting additional pressure on our services. So I think I just really wanted to share that, there are benefits, there are costs, and who gets the benefits and who deals with the long-term costs in our communities, and who speaks for our future generations. Our teaching in Gitxsan is Gwachiaenst, and that's our right and our responsibility to pass on our territory in a sustainable manner. And so we're always thinking of our future generations, just the way our ancestors thought of us, and they fought to protect our territory. They fought for the health of our territory. And we all, whether we're Gitxsan or Niska or Tsimshan, we all have a Dawch oral history where we learned a lesson, where we took too much, or where we played with our food and we disrespected our food, our salmon, our mountain goats. We all know those Adawch, and they taught us that you will suffer consequences. Nature will teach you, whether it is a volcano eruption, wiping out a community, or landslides, or downfalls of our communities. That is what our teachings are based.
I'll just give Tara a moment to see if she comes back, because I really want to hear what she's saying. just give another 10 or 15 seconds, and if we can come back to Tara too. Okay, I think maybe it makes sense to move to you, Colin, since I can see your face moving. And yeah, I'll just pass it on to Gold Commander if you want to introduce yourself.
I guess I think Taro is getting too real, so Cesis had to intervene. Oh, there. I'll let you finish up, Tara. Then I'll jump in if.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'm on a hot spot.
Mhm.
Yeah, just to one of the last things I wanted to share was that our local MLA and Minister of Waterland Resource Stewardship, Nathan Cullen, has been heard a number of times saying, well, it's very quiet. I don't hear any opposition. I don't hear anything. And, for these people, silence is consent. And so use your voice, tag him in social media, tag him in direct messages or what have you, just to let people know what your thoughts are. If you are concerned, share those concerns, share them with your leaders, and share them with your elected officials as well. Gitxsan.
Thank you so much, Tara. Yeah, and then I'll just move right over to you, Colin. Thanks.
Hey, I'm a Yuxa, everyone. My name is Colin Sutherland Wilson, Hochgi of Wilpstibasa, Gisras Pedegai, the Fireweed clan of Anspayach and from the Gitxsan Nation. And yeah, just first want to say big thank you to everyone who I see on the participant list. Lots of Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, lots of friends and family and allies, and it's just a real privilege to be here. And thank you, Tara. Thank you, Kai and Miriam. I'm really happy to be on a panel of such esteemed individuals. And yeah, I think in regards to these colonial projects, I have quite a few thoughts right off the bat. Maybe for context, I should also add that I'm currently serving as the chief counselor in Kispiox, as well as I do contract work and work independently for my WILP as a Lahia protection specialist. And so quite often, when we have issues arise that may impact our Lahip, whether that's forestry, whether that's oil and gas, whether that's mining or other proposals that are being brought towards our WILP's territory, I'll often be on those issues quite promptly. So I think Coastal GasLink is, it's all the evidence we need of how the province operates, how these industries operates, and what their overall strategy is in order to effectively contain the Delgumuk decision. Because what we've seen is, efforts at all levels to essentially not give any weight to this idea that, Gitxsan or Gitanyow or Wet'suwet'en, that any of our territories can effectively act independently of the Canadian state. And basically, there's just been a baseline strategy of non-recognition of either our title or even in the most recent case where we had Zahel, Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief of the Laksamasu clan, where he was the first of the Dineze to be charged with the violation of the Coastal GasLink injunction. And in that decision, the justice made it explicitly clear that they could not reconcile what they called imprecisely defined Wet'suwet'en trespass law with the Canadian courts, which in this case was the injunctive relief order that was issued by the Supreme Court of British Columbia in order to essentially stop Wet'suwet'en resistance to the Coastal GasLink project. And so, this trend, I think, follows along many other trends where even, getting down to the baseline of, Gitxsan Crown relations, or even Wet'suwet'en Crown relations, or as I would think, pretty much any of the WILP-based societies who operate under our clan WILP structures with the Lahip. And I think the baseline relationship at this point has always been that, even in treaty negotiations, the Crown refuses to recognize our way of life, our governance, our culture. Basically, the Guelchiens, which to them is completely incommensurate with Canadian law, with the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. And so even in like the highest level dialogues that are meant to be resolving the outstanding land issues, the outstanding title issues, you'll often hear that, your society or your people must adopt some form of band council governance because to them, it's completely untenable that they'll be working long term with a hereditary house-based society. And so we've seen this at the negotiating table. We've seen this in the courts, especially we've seen it out on the land, where you'll often see the security or policing forces working with these major projects, taking a stance of complete denial of any house-based title on the territories, even to the point where, in my direct experience, in the case of Zahale, I was arrested right alongside him out on Tsayu territory. And so even in my experience in dealing with the CERG officers or Community Industry Response Group officers, which I think in the near future, they'll be changing their name to a more permanent position. I think it's BC Crew or Crew BC, the Crisis Response Unit of British Columbia, as they've secured a lot of funding with the current government to become a permanent fixture of enforcing injunctive orders against Indigenous people in BC. But in my experience with them, I've noticed even as a part of their training that they receive anti-Delgamuukw, anti-Aboriginal rights and title argumentative training. I can't tell you how many times where I've simply gotten in a shouting match with an officer and his whole position is adamantly, well, the court's never recognized your title. That it doesn't exist, that there's nothing. And, that was kind of across the board. So that gives you a bit of the sentiment of, what their modus operandi is, because it's not necessarily a impartial enforcement of an injunctive relief order, but also that, they do receive some kind of, I would say, training that goes outside of the scopes of the injunctions, because, the justice in these cases doesn't write down explicitly, that like your position here is to completely disregard, the Delgamuukw decision and Supreme Court case law. And so I think, we have to start thinking very strategically on our end, because there's a very clear line that we have to hold, especially as the governments of these lands, of these Lachiep, of the Yinta, and that line is between us and the Crown. Because I think, there's clearly strategies that are in place to bleed that line, to make it unclear. We've seen that with, the rhetoric around Coastal GasLink, with basically the complete diminution of the hereditary governments, in favor of the, I guess you'd say the elected band council governments. But I can assure you too that, as a chief counselor in Kispiox, yeah, I would say that, unless there was a referendum that was publicized within the community, like many of these decisions, I would not necessarily count as the democratic process. And as a citizen of the WILP, I can assure you that within our governance system, I would liken that to a direct democracy, of the WILP members, of the citizens working through the appointed person or Samoyed in order to enact the will of the WILP. And so I think just on a strategic level, like we really, I think, have to be very cognizant that, at the end of the day, we exist on the periphery of the big strategy of Canada. You know, we are simply an expected obstacle, a liability, or I think maybe a better way to put it would be maybe a contingency, not contingency, but within the budget, we're just expected obstacle. Let's just stick with that. And at the end of the day, they need to bring resources through our territories. They need our valleys to fill full of water to create batteries for the rest of the province. They need basically just to move us out of the way in order to keep the Canadian economy going. Because, in any democracy, you're following the will of the majority, and the majority do not live up here. The majority live, Southern Canada and the big cities, and Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, Victoria. And yeah, and basically, in my mind, I think we're going to see a lot more proposals on the Gitxsan territory and our neighboring territories. Right now, there's the big rush for fossil fuels because globally there is, these deadlines that have been put in place, and I think we can argue a lot about how strictly they're adhering to these deadlines. But, it seems to me that within those parameters, there's a big rush to get this all to market, to make the most of it while this market does exist, before the popular sentiment is to basically do a full-on transition into a new energy infrastructure. But then anticipating that transition, I would say that, our territories in the north, which are a literal gold mine of resources that are necessary for this transition, where you have on the Gitxsan territory alone, lithium and antimony and copper and all these other what would be classified as critical resources, those would be next on the chopping block. And I think, in my mind, this is a part of a long-term strategy in order to secure Canada's energy future, which requires our territories to be the sacrifice. And, even talking about, the so-called greenwashing of these heavy polluting projects such as, Coastal GasLink and the Enbridge West Coast Connector and, Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Line, which are all connected to the Montney Play, one of the biggest gas fields, I think, in Western Canada, which, is anticipated to become one of the largest methane bombs in the world in terms of emissions. So even taking all that into account, these projects will simply open the way to the rest of the territories, as we've seen on Wet'suwet'en territory, where Coastal GasLink, that right away opened up valleys that were previously untouched, pristine spawning grounds, habitats, which led to a huge boom in clear-cut logging. And in my mind, we'll see a lot more mining permits. We'll see a lot more resource extraction, people taking advantage of that access of those right-of-ways. And then yeah, and then basically to power all this, in order to make this green, they're using these dams as a justification. But like Tara mentioned, and I think I touched upon, we're not just going to need site C, we're going to need site D, E, F, G. And, there probably won't even be any of the Peace River left by the time we're done with, making these projects sustainable across northern BC. And so I think, just if I can impart anything to anyone, we're going to fight being a sacrifice zone, because we have to take our best interests into account. With the Lachip, we already have to contend with increased droughts. We have to contend with a whole host of adversity as a result of, climate change and impacts to our ocean and our fisheries as is. And, there is a sustainable way of life that we're protecting up here. And it's our utmost duty to protect the Guelchians. And I think I might be going a bit over time, so I'm going to cut it off there and just thank you, everyone. And, especially thank you. I see a lot of great dialogue in chat, and yeah, hopefully we can address those questions afterwards. Hamia Sabah.
Thank you so much, Colin. I personally just really appreciate you touching on Gitxsan governance structures and the deeply communal processes that ground them. And for me as a settler, it's just like a lot of leadership around the kind of communal relationships I want to be developing, yeah, with my own folks. Yeah, and given everything that you and Tara have said about cops and courts and corporations, it's pretty obvious that we're going to need like deep and wide grassroots mobilizations to stop these projects. And that kind of leads me to Miriam. And I guess, Miriam, the question I have for you is like, what kind of political work should we be prioritizing to build these movements, particularly in this like moment where we're moving to the right? Yeah, thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Seb. Yeah, before I get to that question, I just want to thank all of the panelists for PDI for putting this on, for inviting me. This has been really great, especially because I don't think that we're hearing enough about all of these projects and about the resistance that is happening. So really grateful to be part of this panel. My name is Miriam Madrangi. I'm the Canadian Activism Manager with Ben & Jerry's, and Ben & Jerry's is also a partner in the Abolish Kurg network that Kai mentioned earlier. The Community Industry Response Group, but everyone on this panel has mentioned it. And I think just going back to Seb's question of in this age of, when we're seeing our electoral politics really shift to the right, what does resistance look like? And I think there's definitely people on this call and definitely in the participants list who definitely know what resistance looks like. It is, I think, remarkable to say that this year in 2024, over half the world's population is eligible to vote in federal elections and national elections. And I think a lot of people have been talking about how in so many countries that looks like far right or nationalist, right wing politicians are getting into power. We do in BC have this interesting situation where we have this centrist left, however they want to market themselves, government. But really, they're also in a situation where if any progressive is out there saying, hey, you're not progressive enough, they're playing this political line of, well, where are you going to go? You kind of have to vote for us because whatever else you got is a little more right than us. So we're your best bet. And I wonder if a lot of places are playing that game, and a lot of politicians are playing those politics. We see that also in the States with Biden. And so it's not uncommon that we're seeing that. I think what that means for our organizing and for our movements is that we really have to organize outside of those electoral politics and outside of the reliance of what people in those electoral positions of power are going to do, because what we're seeing is that they're incredibly unreliable. We know that, yeah, here in BC, we have the BC NDP, and yet they're still incredibly favorable to industry. They're still enabling these projects. They're slashing and gutting their environmental protections. They're towing this line of we believe in reconciliation, and we're going to make this BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, but we're also going to put in these provisions that favor industry. So they're towing this line that is not favorable for communities. So what we really have to do as organizers, as advocates, and just people in communities, we really have to be changing it up and dictating the frames of the debate ourselves. Because we have these politicians with great megaphones and they're saying how we want our communities to be structured, but we really have to be amplifying and propping up the models that we want to see happen. We can't enable politicians and we can't see them as leaders because we've been told for years that they're not showing the leadership we want. So we have to reshape and dictate what that looks like on the ground for us. So we can't just say, hey, disband Kurg, disband the critical response unit. We have to set the stage where they're not even allowed in our communities. We need municipalities to saying we want to distance ourselves from the critical response unit, not make relationships with them. It came out recently that the Kurd was seen to show the national best practice of policing. And we have no idea where that came from. This unit is currently under review by the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. This is the citizen, or supposedly the watchdog for police. And so while they're under review, we're seeing that they're the national best practice. We're seeing their budgets get inflated. And what we actually need to be shifting is how our communities talk about this. Is how is a paramilitary policing unit being able to be propped up? And the reason that's so relevant is that they are so present and so active in northern BC along Highway 16, where people are so actively saying that they don't want these projects. And what's happening? Are the politicians saying, okay, we won't put in those projects? No, they're sending in this policing unit with an inflated budget to be the face of squashing that resistance. And so we need to counter that by really dismantling what we know of this policing unit, what we know of politicians who are in leadership, and really propping up the leadership that's on the ground, talking about Chief Sahel's trial, which was mentioned earlier, propping up the leadership that's been coming out of Wet'suwet'en, out of Gitxsan territory, out of Gitanyow territory. And this is a long game, but that's what we need to be doing in our organizing, is not relying on these politicians and not having the hook be, we won't vote for you if you don't make these changes, but to actually say, these are our communities and this is what you won't even get away with.
Nice, thanks. I hear you saying, okay, as folks in grassroots struggle, trying to support Gitanyow and Gitxsan leadership, shouldn't be trying to get caught up in electoral politics. Yes. And then I guess I wonder, like, as someone who has been like inside and outside of NGOs doing Indigenous solidarity for a long time, I guess I'm curious, like, what are some ways you see NGOs getting in the way of deepening anti-colonial struggle? And also, what are some ways that you see NGOs actually supporting and enabling that deepening of resistance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a long essay question. We could talk about this forever. I've been involved in nonprofit sector or nonprofit adjacent for about almost 2 decades, and this conversation really has shifted. And I think what's key is talking about how and why it has shifted. I remember, 15 years ago, there was a huge critique of nonprofits who were either sidestepping the desires of impacted people or the needs of impacted people, or even completely undermining those struggles. And I think a lot of it comes down to accountability and where we hold our accountability. And I'd say that not just the nonprofit sector, but even academia and research, the legal sector and lawyers, a lot of times their accountability is not aligned to people who are impacted and most impacted on the ground. And I think that piece is so fundamental to wherever whatever sector we work in, whether it's the medicine, social work, all of these pieces really come into movement work. And if we, or if people in nonprofit sectors, again, research and legal, if they are demonstrating accountability to people who are most impacted, like in the case of all of what we've been talking about, people who are most impacted by these projects, then we really see the conversations shift. If we have deep relationships, and this goes to what I was saying earlier, we need to create communities that are really embedded in relationships and expanding our political understanding, because we're having conversations between Indigenous people, settler communities, non-Indigenous communities, with lawyers, with researchers, with nonprofits, with people who have access to funding, foundations. If we're having these conversations more broadly, then we can start to critically think of where our accountability lies and call it out when it isn't lying with Indigenous communities. And that's what really muddies the waters when it comes to the nonprofit sector, when it comes to grassroots organizations, is where does our accountability lie? Does it align with funders? Does it align with an organization's arbitrary needs? Or does it align with the people who are on the ground and truly saying, okay, what is needed, what is happening, where are the shifts, and what needs to happen to get us there. Because once we have those conversations person to person with relationships, we can have those conversations more broadly within the sector we work in, more broadly within our organizations, or more broadly within our networks.
Thanks, Miriam. Well, it's 6:25, and so that makes me think what we could do is just have like a closing round. And I thought I could start with Kai and then move back to Miriam and then Colin and end with Tara, and just give each of you a chance to like say that thing that's been on the tip of your tongue for the last half hour, or like plug something that you really want us to know about, or if there was a question or comment in the chat that caught your attention, you're welcome to address that. So I'll start off with Kai and then Miriam.
Sure. Thanks, Seb. Thanks for all the questions in the chat. I can see us trying to answer those as we go, and I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I wanted to put in a plug for just the incredible work that the Gitanyow Chief's Office is doing. If you go to gitanyowchiefs.com, they have a whole news section where you can see in real time these concerns being raised around projects like SLISMs, and the chiefs have thrown down the gauntlet to the BC government, which is conducting the review of this terminal, and said, you know, if you can't force this company to actually provide data to back up its claims, then you need to pause this review until the studies can be done. So yeah, I just wanted to lift up the work that Tara and Mali and the team at the Chief's Office is doing. And I would say it's really important, you know, to support their authority to make an informed decision. And if the BC government isn't willing to do that, if they're going to be derelict in their duty to collect the basic information to make a decision about a terminal that's going to change life in BC as we know it, then I think we need to put our weight and our support behind a level of government that is doing that due diligence. And right now, that is the Gitanyow Chiefs. So I would just want to encourage people to write a letter, if you can, to our outgoing environment minister, or hey, you might bump into George Heyman if you're down in Vancouver, and really help reinforce this call, because yeah, the chief's authority needs to be respected, and that call for the information to make a decision, I think, needs to be taken seriously.
Right on. Thanks, Kai. Miriam, is there anything that you were hoping to plug here at the end? Your turn.
Yeah, just piggybacking off what Kai said, I think even though I'm like, we need to organize building communities outside of electoral politics, I still think it's really crucial that we hold people in power accountable for what they are doing. Taking something like these projects up north, we've seen the Wet'suwet'en for over a decade, like very public campaign. We've seen that resistance grow, and when there is growth in resistance, we also see the growth in repression. And so when we are watching repression on Gitanyow or Gitxsan resistance, we need to really be there and present, because we are faced with politicians who are, in an age of reconciliation, really using that to mask the fact that they're actually acting in an opposite, more colonial way. In 2015, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, came out with their 94 calls to action. In 2017, we saw the emergence of this policing unit that disproportionately polices Indigenous people. And not only that, the ideation of this unit came, and the inspiration came from seeing the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was very clearly an Indigenous resistance movement with police repression. And so we're seeing that this idea of reconciliation that our politicians are touting is really a facade to allow and enable all these other things to happen, such as, you know, a policing unit that is still getting millions of dollars every year under the guise of public safety, when we've seen their egregious and violent behavior be anything but public safety. We've seen the videos go viral of them holding Indigenous women at gunpoint. It's made international news, and yet we're seeing that this is all in the name of public safety. And so we do need to be holding those politicians accountable while also playing the long game of building communities that really know what reconciliation are and are actually having meaningful conversations between Indigenous, non-Indigenous people, but also, unions, labor organizations, lawyers, researchers, all of these different sectors. We really need to be talking across sectors, because we know on the flip side, politicians are talking with industry, they are talking with policing, they're talking cross-border, they're talking with financial institutions, the fossil fuel sector. They are talking amongst sectors to really build the power they have and the control they want. We need to be doing that on the flip side as well.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Colin.
Yeah, I think, the strategies around, how do we address the fundamental issue? That's critical. And, on one hand, I think us as the WILPs, as our governments, we constantly have people working on this. We have great, our own legislative functions. We have our own governance functions, our Simgiget, our Sigdam Hanak, and the WILPs, which, which are fundamental to our ayok, to our law and the implementation of it. And there's constantly people on our end who, we have to do that internal work, but also to help ensure that that stops getting dismissed by the Crown. But I think on the other end, for the folks in British Columbia, for folks who, I would say more so fall under the umbrella of the Crown, as citizens of Canada and what have you, there's definitely a lot of work that can be done to put pressure on your communities to actually have the hard conversations around land, around culture, around genocide. And what this ultimately boils down to, which I think in my mind can be simplified, is you have your elected politicians who are working overtime, with international corporations and all these other entities to basically consolidate the spoils and lands acquired during genocide. And I think that's the ultimate dynamic that needs to be addressed. And, I think the only way that, we could really move forward in a respectful relationship between, our government and your government would be, basically for that land back factor to happen. And then we take it from there. Because, I think no one here is discounting the possibility of, some type of coexistence going on into the future. That's a part of our laws, our culture, our ayok, which is respect for all life and the spirit that lives in the land and in all things. But, I think there's work to be done on your end and work to be done on our end, especially as Gitxsan people, for us to basically put up an effective resistance to these types of projects and to anticipate, the countless obstacles that are going to be coming our way, whether that's from corporations, from Canada, from climate change. And yeah, and I just really want to say a big shout out to the Gitanyow and Tara and, and Mali versus King Charles III, because, and what you can do on your end as Canadians or maybe as folks throughout Canada, funding is always a big one, because these court cases cost money, costs a lot of time. And I could say even for my house group, we have been indebted from a injunction court case since 2018, which we're still paying off. And I think that's the case for a lot of folks who get on the ground and do these fights. But from our side, the Gitlushmahetwit side, I can also confidently say that we haven't had Crown presence on our territory for the past 3 years, because we basically shut down all of their logging operations, and we have a Crown-free Lachip, which, it takes a lot of work to maintain and fight for. But, I just want to say, emphasize right now, if there's folks who could do fundraising or support for the Gitanyow for this court case, learn about, what they've been working on, because, I saw a question in there about, how do we move from Delgamuch? Like, I think on the individual levels, you're going to find many house groups that are going to be working to push these issues forward. But I think right now, one of the very important ones is the village of Gitanyow, which is ultimately, in my mind, currently the spearhead that's going to be, you know, seeing what other possibilities exist there. And if we can finally penetrate through that crown armor of, you know, deniability of our way of life, then I think, you know, it's worth it to put some energy behind that thrust. So thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. And Tara, last word.
Doik Sitnism, Doik Sitney and Colin for your really wonderful words of support. And for everybody else in the chat, I've been trying to type with one hand while I'm keeping my hotspot open, but so much awesome comments and questions. And feel free to reach out if you ever want to follow up on anything that we couldn't cover today or this evening. I think for me closing, I just want to share, you know, I did see some comments and I've heard many comments in our communities around potentially leaders who have signed with these companies. And, you know, the teachings that I always bring to this are from the Signam Hanak, the aunties that helped raise me and teach me constantly. Some of them are blood aunties, some of them are just aunties in the community. And they teach kindness and unity, you know, and that, yes, people will maybe be ashamed that they signed these agreements. And yes, they impact many more people than themselves. And they didn't have maybe all the information they needed at that time. But we can, you know, share with them that information in a respectful way and always lead with our hearts and always lead with the best intentions for our people and not to blame one another and not to feed into the divide and conquer that, you know, is intended by these companies. They want to pit us against one another. And so always lead with our hearts, lead with the best knowledge that we have. And we're all very caring people. Like we can see that in the chat. So many people are bringing up things that I've never thought about, and I appreciate that. So we care about our lands and waters, but we also have to care for one another, even when some of our people make mistakes. Some of our leaders might make mistakes, whether it's our own nation or our neighboring nations, and to just remember to be kind to one another because it's hard enough as it is as Indigenous people. Doik Sitnism Gabit.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to all of you for the knowledge and the wisdom that you've shared. I really hope that all of us on the call can like carry that into our own communities as inspiration to deepen our resistance and solidarity with you and your struggles. Yeah, I hope that we can do this again. We'll need to do this again. And yeah, in the meantime, I hope folks follow all of the different organizations and things that are going on that our panelists have shared with us. So from PBI, thank you very much, and we'll be all in touch. Take care.